Hey everybody, Lon Gold here, comedian, actor, pro-Semite. I am the host of a show called Stars of David, and I have a trusty sidekick named
Eli Leonard.
Anyway, last season on Stars of David, we schmoozed, we joked, we asked big questions. It's going to be even better this season. Wouldn't you say, Eli?
Yeah, the laughs are going to be bigger because I'm going to be talking more.
So join us for conversations with the likes of Yochai Sponder, Yonit Levy, Biana Golodriga, Tiffany Haddish, and more. And when I say more, I mean way more. In fact, ending the season with a superstar of David. So you're going to learn stuff. You're going to think about life, identity, and the joy and occasional pain of being Jewish. It's going to be what, Eli?
It's going to be a machaya.
A machaya. So tune in to Stars of David with Elon Gold wherever you get your podcasts, or find us on YouTube at Unpacked Podcasts. You're going to love it. I promise. Good Yontif.
Good Yontif.
Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and this is Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode is sponsored by Friedkin Philanthropies and the Koret Foundation and is inspired by Israel 21C. To sponsor an episode of Unpacking Israeli History or just to say what's up, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. Before we start, as always, check us out on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, all the places. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. Okay, yalla. Let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
Before October 7th, if I'd asked a group of Jewish non-Israelis if they had ever heard of the amazing Israeli sketch comedy show Eretz Nehederet, usually they'd all look at me and say something like, huh? Post the 7th of October, however, the SNL-esque skits have made the rounds on Jewish social media. Who can forget the show's skewering of the Columbia encampments, or the Red Cross, or the Thunberg-led Gaza flotilla? Links in the show notes. But the Eretz Nehederet sketch that came to mind immediately when we started working on this episode wasn't any of the trendy, social media-ready clips that have been flooding my feed in the past couple of years. That's because this clip comes from the dark ages before social media was really a thing. I mean, maybe Facebook existed. MySpace? Maybe MySpace, but barely. In fact, this clip is so old, I couldn't even find it on YouTube anymore. So you're just going to have to trust me that A, it exists, and B, it's funny. The target of this particular clip was Israel's humanitarian aid industry. On screen, here's what you got. 2 dudes, some dogs, a disaster zone in the background, some kind of tropical storm raging. And every 5 seconds, one of the guys reminds the viewer that they're from Israel. They sent humanitarian aid from Israel. Wasn't that nice of Israel? Isn't Israel so great for coming to a disaster zone in the third world in the midst of a massive storm? If you aren't familiar with old school Israeli hasbara or public diplomacy, the clip isn't very funny. If you are, though, this skit is right on the money. It's actually hilarious because it pokes fun at a very common tendency across Israel and the Jewish diaspora, highlighting how good Israel is at all the things in a somewhat futile attempt to burnish the country's image abroad. Like, bet you didn't know Israel invented the cherry tomato, or the USB, or the camera pill. Bet you didn't know that Israel sends tons of aid to disaster zones all over the world. Take that, haters. But seriously, please like us now. Please, please, please. This flavor of hasbara, it was never particularly effective. And I'm not trying to poo-poo it. Well, I'm not trying to be difficult here. I'm just saying, as a tool of hasbara, of public diplomacy, it wasn't so effective. In fact, this strategy often backfired, resulting in accusations of various types of washing, greenwashing, pinkwashing, social washing. In case you're unfamiliar, I'll explain. Washing basically means using positive accomplishments like eco-friendliness. That would be greenwashing. LGBTQ rights. That would be pinkwashing. Humanitarian aid or whatever. I guess that's social washing. To distract from a country's quote-unquote inherent evils. The concept began as a criticism of corporate advertising, but has since ballooned to apply to all sorts of, again, quote-unquote, problematic entities. But after the 7th of October, it became painfully clear that it wouldn't matter if Israel somehow cured cancer or solved climate change or discovered unicorns. To a not insignificant percentage of the world, the Jewish state will always be guilty no matter what it does or doesn't do, no matter how much aid it sends abroad or how many unicorns it has. Roughly 100, by the way. And by unicorns, I mean startups valued at over $1 billion. So my team and I really struggled with the framing of this episode. Maybe you're hearing it in my voice right now. Because our topic for the next 2 weeks is Israeli humanitarian aid. And not just government-sponsored aid, though we'll talk about that too. Mostly, though, we delved deep into the story of IsraAid, Israel's biggest and best-known humanitarian NGO, looking for an answer to a question that haunts me. Why does Israel have such a genuinely impressive record of humanitarian aid missions? Why does the state send search and rescue teams, doctors, food, necessities, whatever, to uninfluential countries thousands of miles away? I mean, really, why? Is it just about building good PR, public diplomacy, hasbara? Or is there something about Israel's actual mission, like as a mission as a country, that compels this tiny and embattled chunk of land to reach out to countries all over the world in their time of need, no matter how geopolitically irrelevant they might be? Truly, no shade to the Democratic Republic of Congo or Romania or Haiti, but these aren't particularly powerful or geopolitically important countries. Is the potential of good PR really worth the expense and inconvenience of sending supplies and talent to dangerous places? Or is something else at play? For that matter, what about IsraAid itself, which is entirely separate from the government? What is their mission? Why do they provide aid to hostile places? Ready for this? Including the Gaza Strip, in the middle of a war with their own country. And most importantly, how do we answer any of these questions without recycling cringe hasbara tropes or sounding like an ad? As this piece evolved through multiple discussions and drafts and thoughts and reflections, I wanted to keep sight of one essential fact. We're telling this story because it blends history, intrigue, and the day-to-day reality of ordinary Israelis, getting to know Israelis as a real thing, not Israel as some abstract concept. In other words, we're telling the story because it is directly relevant to Israel's history, present, and future, because it features a cross-section of Israeli civil society working both within and outside of Israel's borders, and because it's a genuine and honest look at Israeli foreign policy, public diplomacy, and society as seen through the prism of humanitarian aid. For decades, international aid was a cornerstone of Israeli diplomacy. And that is exactly where we're going to start. Not with an NGO, but with a brief history of Israel's quote-unquote soft diplomacy, with all its ups and downs. Once we set the stage, we'll talk about the birth of the NGO IsraAid, including two of its most impactful stories. And in the second chapter of this two-part episode, let's learn about what happens when an Israeli aid NGO goes into Gaza itself. What is that like? I'm stoked to tell you these stories. I hope they inspire you as much as they inspired me. Okay, chapter 1. Soft diplomacy. One of my favorite things about hosting a history podcast is the fact that I can unironically say things like, friends, let's get in our time machine and go back to the 1950s. So unless you're operating heavy machinery, I want you to close your eyes and imagine yourself back in 1950s Israel. Oh, and in this scenario, you're David Ben-Gurion, the country's first prime minister. Are you there with me? You're rocking the flyaway hair, right? You're amazing at headstands. Seriously, there are pictures, even a statue. The guy loved a good headstand. What can I say? By the way, who doesn't love a good headstand? Who doesn't? And you spend most of your time figuring out how to keep your country going, which means building alliances. Unfortunately, every single one of the neighbors is sworn to your destruction. Even more unfortunately, you've got very few natural resources, simmering ethnic tensions, and almost no money. Guys, remind me never to run for prime minister. Sounds rough. But Ben-Gurion was not the kind of guy who gave up easily. If the neighbors didn't want to be friends, he reasoned, why not look further afield? Let's go to another community, he said. Okay, so the Arab and Muslim countries were basically one cool kid's table that refused to let nerdy little Israel sit with them. And sure, the U.S. was cagey, still wooing the Arab bloc, while the USSR had made its allegiance very clear. But there was a whole world outside of the Middle East and beyond the American and Soviet empires. Like, for example, Africa. Africa, a continent that in the late 1950s was coming into its own. Its 54 countries shucking off colonial overlords and taking their first tentative steps as free and independent nations. Israel knew something about what that was like. And even though the Jewish state wasn't rolling in wealth, it did have one important resource: human capital. Just a few decades prior, the pre-state Jewish community had built a country from the ground up, establishing institutions, eradicating malaria, waging war against the aridity of the region, that means it was dry, and winning thanks to a drip irrigation technique pioneered in 1959. They may not have had the cash of an empire like the United States or the USSR, but the Israelis had knowledge, they had experience, they had know-how, and a real desperate need for friends. So with Ben-Gurion at the helm and Foreign Minister Golda Meir by his side, the Israeli government started reaching out to African countries, asking, hey, need anything? And these newly independent countries responded with enthusiasm. Actually, we need all the things. Whatever you got, we need the things. With Golda Meir at the helm, Israelis started dispatching as much human capital as they could spare. They sent agronomists to Ghana, doctors to Ethiopia, engineers to Kenya, soldiers and architects to Uganda. And all the while, as Israelis dug wells and built schools, as they demonstrated best agricultural practices and trained newborn militaries, they flew the blue and white flag. By the 1960s, the Jewish state was crushing the humanitarian aid game. It sent over 1,800 experts to 32 African countries, training local students in agriculture, medicine, education, and engineering. And it accepted hundreds of students from all over Africa to study at Israeli universities, train in Israeli hospitals, and live on Israeli kibbutzim. This is the golden period of what people call the Israeli Africa mania. As the former head of the Shin Bet, we used to call it, and the feeling was mutual. African heads of state were charmed by the small, demure-seeming Israeli foreign minister, especially when she led them in a hora, which became her signature move during fancy functions. What a move. All over the continent, people named their kids after her. It's really crazy. Little Golda Meirs cropping up in cities and rural villages from Togo to Cameroon. For Golda Meir, this is more than just work. This was a calling, no matter how difficult. In 1958, she warned a group of new foreign service members that, quote, representing the Jewish state can be a very lonely experience. Israel is entirely by itself in the international community. But she also felt that, quote, relations with Africa are the central point in Israel's life, not merely her foreign policy. This was more than just savvy diplomacy. These missions felt personal. They felt Jewish. They felt core to the Jewish state's identity. And there was no story that reinforced this feeling more than the story of Liberia's president, William Tubman. I'm going to quote directly from Lioness Francine Klagsbrun's excellent biography of Golda Meir. She writes of Tubman, quote, in 1947, he had cast the decisive vote in the UN General Assembly that created the State of Israel. When Golda asked him why he had done that, given Arab pressure on him to vote against Israel, he told of coming to the United States as a young man to plead his country's cause in Washington, which had accused it of slave labor and cut off all relations. A congregational committee questioned him brutally and treated him with derision, except for one congressman, Emanuel Seller, a Jew who befriended him and helped him present his case. With that, he became a lifelong friend of the Jews. The story delighted Golda, and the two developed a warm and lasting relationship, end quote. Emanuel Seller had no agenda when he took Tubman under his wing back in 1931. Tubman was not yet a head of state. There was no United Nations, no talk of partitioning Palestine, no mustached German chancellor with a genocidal plan, at least not formally communicated to the world. In short, Seller wasn't playing 4D chess. He was kind because he was kind. with no expectation of reward. And yet that small act of kindness changed the course of Jewish history. That's an awesome story, guys. That's awesome. And from what I've read about her time in Africa, I think it's safe to say that Golda Meir truly believed in the world-changing power of kindness. I think she believed in it. Of course she was a politician. Don't be naive. Of course she was a politician. Of course she was a diplomat. Be serious, Noam. And of course, all of these visits had a political agenda. Of course. But I believe that multiple things can be true at the same time without contradicting one another, right? You do too. And Israel's early relationship with these young African countries wasn't motivated solely by quid pro quo. It wasn't solely transactional. There was a real satisfaction that came with helping people, with sharing hard-won expertise, with taking part in another person's transformation for the better and another country's transformation for the better. Unless that person is Idi Amin Dada, the bloodthirsty dictator of Uganda. Typically, when I'm talking about bloodthirsty dictators, all bets are off. Israel had been tight with the Ugandans ever since their independence in 1962. That friendship didn't end when Idi Amin seized power in 1971 through a military coup naturally. I'm talking military training, infrastructure projects, the works. In an absolutely insane and delightful quirk of history, an Israeli architecture firm designed the Entebbe airport, where Palestinian and German terrorists held 102 mostly Israeli hostages for a tense week in 1976. Don't remember that story? Rewind to Season 2, Episode 1. You know where to find the link. The show notes. It's in the show notes. But roughly a year into this mutual love fest, Idi Amin asked the Israelis for some heavy weaponry, free of charge, so he could destroy his southern neighbor, Tanzania. The Israeli said verbatim, "Listen, Haboob." That's like the Israeli version of buddy, except 1,000 times more intense because of the "Listen, Haboob, we'll sell you weapons, but you gotta actually pay for them." Okay, maybe that wasn't a direct quote. It doesn't really sound like the way diplomacy works. But I love the image of an Israeli government official raising an eyebrow at Amin like, you want how many dollars worth of weapons free of charge from a country a tenth of your size with a fraction of your natural resources and its own economic and security problems? Sure, buddy. Sure. Sounds good. Like most brutal dictators, Idi Amin didn't like hearing the word no. He wasn't into it. Seemingly overnight, he switched sides. That's so immature. That's so juvenile. Anyway, the man who had once embraced Moshe Dayan at state dinners was now cozying up to another unhinged autocrat, the always fabulously dressed Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and saying things like, quote, this is a good one. Germany is the right place where when Hitler was the prime minister and supreme commander, he burned over 6 million Jews. This is because Hitler and all German people knew that Israelis are not people who are working in the interests of the people of the world, and that is why they burned the Israelis alive with gas in the soil of Germany. Charming. Really charming. Thanks, Gaddafi. But this isn't an episode about Idi Amin or fashion icon Gaddafi, though both are excellent and wildly entertaining subjects if you gloss over their policies of state sanctioning torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial murder. Nerd corner alert. There were also some fun rumors that Idi Amin was into cannibalism in his spare time. I don't know what that means in his spare time. It's like I don't know. He finished watching YouTube and he was like, oh, I now could do cannibalism. But anyway, seriously, this seems like someone to stay away from. That's what I'd say. The point is, sometimes the Israeli government's humanitarian efforts doesn't quite have the intended effect, especially when it comes to hostile countries. I'll give you a perfect example, because I know that you're like, which example? What? Give me an example. No, I'll give you a perfect example. Lebanon. Here's what happened. When a massive explosion rocked Beirut in August of 2020, so we're not like going far into history here, killing more than 200 and displacing hundreds of thousands, Israel approached the UN with a message. Hey, if Lebanon wants help, we're there. This was a huge move. At the time, Lebanon was more or less controlled by Hezbollah, one of the proxy militias established by Israel's arch enemy, the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Lebanese government refused the offer. There are some things that governments just can't do. Bridges they cannot cross. NGOs, however, are a very different story. These non-governmental organizations, that's what NGO stands for, operate independently, free of government meddling or state control, even if they receive state funding. Most importantly, they're generally founded and run by private citizens, people who see a problem and decide to take matters into their own hands. People like Yotam Politzer. Chapter 2, The Disaster Junkie. When I first met Yotam Politzer, I was skeptical. Not of Yotam himself. He's lovely, like really lovely, with a dry Israeli humor and very cute little kids who occasionally wandered in and waved at me. Zoom meetings. But I was skeptical of some of the big claims I'd heard about him. In her email introducing us, my awesome colleague Laura Stoyer wrote, "I'm excited for you to be in touch, as I have no doubt you will enjoy getting to know each other, and that your partnership will greatly benefit the Jewish people and the world." Like, okay, Laura, love you too, but come on. Our partnership will benefit the world? Let's not get carried away. Sure, that's IsraAid's whole jam, but still. Yotam's resume was impressive. Obviously, CEO of IsraAid, years of experience in international aid work. But I was expecting, a CEO type. A guy who was all about synergy and leverage and, frankly, hasbara. I mean, how could he not be all about that? He's the head of an Israeli aid organization that goes out into the world, sometimes to very hostile places with the IsraAid logo front and center. But when I actually spoke to Yotam, he was nothing like what I expected. He had a very calm, humble energy. He told absolutely insane stories in a matter-of-fact way, as though everyone knows what it's like to hop on a plane to Sierra Leone as Ebola ravages the population. And he was not even remotely interested in hasbara.
I'm a little bit of a disaster junkie, for sure. After 3 years in Japan working with tsunami survivors, I moved to Sierra Leone, to West Africa during the Ebola crisis, which was terrifying. And then from there, I moved to support Syrian refugees in Greece, and then to Nepal after the earthquake, and then to many other countries. The most recent operation that I personally led before October 7, at least, was an evacuation from Afghanistan.
Chillest disaster junkie ever. But Yotam and his colleagues aren't just chasing adventure. The adrenaline rush is undoubtedly part of it, of course. No one with a functioning self-preservation instinct goes to Sierra Leone during an Ebola outbreak. But if adventure is your only motivation, you're not going to last very long in the field. Aid work isn't glamorous or fun or easy. And the people who dedicate their lives to on-the-ground relief are in it because at heart, they're idealists. They want to help people, no matter how difficult it is, no matter how long it takes. IsraAid has been around since 2001, a loose coalition of Israeli organizations dedicated to international development and disaster relief. Yotam joined a decade later as employee number 2. 4 days after orientation, he was on a plane to Japan.
A catastrophic tsunami rising out of the Pacific, its huge waves sweeping away everything in its path. A massive wall of water that rose as high as 30 feet, swallowing up parts of Japan. Throughout the seaside cities of the north, stunning devastation. At the Sendai airport, it took only 30 seconds for water to overtake the runways. Soon after, the 16-foot airport tunnel overflowed, filling with cars, small planes, and bodies.
It was the strongest earthquake in Japan's history, triggering a tsunami and overwhelming 3 nuclear power plants on the coast. The footage is horrifying. The death toll even worse. Nearly 20,000 people killed. Thousands injured. Thousands missing. Hundreds of thousands displaced. 4 days after the quake, IsraAid arrived in Japan. Not because it was a glamorous place. Not because of the photo ops. Not because of Jiro dreaming of sushi. Not because they were representatives of the Israeli government. But because other human beings were desperate. Other human beings needed help. And Israelis, unfortunately, have too much hands-on experience with disaster response at home over the years. Immediately, search and rescue teams began to plumb the wreckage for survivors. Relief workers handed out necessities. Israeli doctors were the first to set up a field hospital in the hardest hit areas. Later, psychologists would arrive to combat the invisible scars left by the disaster, the grief, the panic attacks, the post-traumatic stress. As the leader of the delegation, Yotam was committed to staying until he was no longer useful. That's IsraAid's motto, after all. First in, last out. He ended up staying for, you want to hear how long he stayed for? This is how long he stayed for. He ended up staying for 3 years. Not 3 weeks. 3 years. By this point, the wreckage had been cleared and infrastructure largely, though not entirely, restored. Coastal communities had been moved to higher ground. The work wasn't done. It will take decades to fully decontaminate Fukushima, but IsraAid had completed its task. There is no shortage of disaster zones around the world. And within the humanitarian aid world, at least, no shortage of crazy people to run, not walk, towards those disasters.
The first thing I think that people knew about us was that we are these Michigan Israelis jumping on plane. Whenever there's a crisis somewhere in the world, we're there usually in the first 72 hours. And that's a big part of our DNA. But what I don't think people know about IsraAid is that we're not just there first on the ground. We're there to stay for as long as we're needed.
He might bristle at this because Yotam is very, very clear that IsraAid has nothing to do with the Israeli government. But to be honest, when I heard that, my first thought was Golda Meir. She had promised African leaders, quote, this is a quote, "We're not trying to establish ourselves in Africa. As soon as our work of assisting is completed, we will move out and on." And IsraAid workers aren't heading to disaster zones because it's good PR. 3 months into a crisis, there are no cameras anymore. No international broadcasts about ongoing starvation or poverty or fallout from a massive natural disaster. The news cycle moves callously fast. Yesterday's tragedy is already old news. When you have a vested interest in looking good, that matters. But that's not IsraAid's agenda.
IsraAid is a non-governmental, non-political organization, and I think that when people hear IsraAid, they think we are a government organization, and we're not. It's a non-governmental, it sort of represents Israel's civil society, and that's important because that means that we can work with everyone.
That was the moment I got it. The moment I really truly realized and was convinced, frankly, that this has nothing to do with hasbara. IsraAid represents something else. IsraAid represents Israel's civil society. Jews, Arabs, natives, immigrants, the wealthy, the humble, all united by the same desire, the same perspective. Their job is to help wherever they are needed, and not in some uncomfortable Western savior kind of way. Most of IsraAid staff are from the communities they work with.
Altogether, we have about 450 staff members. The majority of them, by the way, are not Israelis. There are local people in the different countries where we operate that we train and support, and they are actually the ones running the show.
Working with locals has a few benefits. The first, of course, is that it prevents Israelis from being murdered in hostile countries. Staying alive, excellent benefit. Like A+. The second is that it ensures that the people on the ground, the people in need, like the focus, are a part of their own recovery. They learn the skills and help build the infrastructure they need to prevent or mitigate the next disaster. A good humanitarian strives to make themselves obsolete by empowering people to help themselves. Working with locals can help do that, like it did in Kenya. Chapter 3, The Drought.
We've been through 5 years of drought, 8 consecutive failed rainy season. Even flying in, it was clear that the conditions are very dry, very hot, very dusty. Nothing's green. Clearly, the landscape and the people are suffering from a severe lack of water.
We do not have challenges in terms of access to water, but also we have challenges in terms of water quality.
This clip was filmed in Turkana country in northwestern Kenya, a dry, harsh, remote corner of East Africa. The air shimmers with heat. The earth is cracked and dusty red. For 5 years, the rains have failed here, and residents are feeling the effects of the worst drought in over 40 years. They can't grow their crops. They can't feed their livestock, which have died in the hundreds of thousands, wiping out the livelihoods of tens of thousands of families. They can't quench their own thirst. They can't cook. They can't bathe. They can't clean. Water is life. And that means drought spells a slow, painful, undignified death. Some people in the village have died because there's not enough food. Because of the water we dig from the river, people have gotten diseases like typhoid, diarrhea, malaria. So the drought brings calamities to the community. My family had some livestock, sheep and goats, but they all died because of the drought. I was doing some farming, but I can't now because there is no rain. We go down to the riverbed and dig a hole. The water is a few feet down. The first water is dirty, so we pour it out until we get to water that looks clean. Every single day, women and children spent hours walking to the dry riverbed under a punishing sun to dig up enough clean water to fill a plastic jerry can. Schools shut down. Kids who should have been getting an education were instead forced to scavenge for water so dirty and brackish that it made them sick. By 2022, some families were surviving on less than 2 gallons of water per week. Let me put that in perspective. International health standards recommend a minimum of 5 gallons a day for for basic survival. A 10-minute shower uses between 18 and 25 gallons, but Turkana's residents were forced to subsist on 2 gallons per family per week. It was as though the earth had turned on the people of Turkana County. After centuries of sustaining them, it was now spitting them out. Polycarp Nagisera grew up in a poor neighborhood in Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, about 300 miles from Turkana. Though he lived in a big city of millions, he had no running water, no sewage system. By the time drought came to Turkana, Polycarp was a water engineer dedicated to solving, or at least assuaging, his country's water shortage. He took a job in Kenya's aid sector, which is where he encountered IsraAid.
I think other organizations, when there is an emergency in some of these areas and they need to respond, they may take 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 month. And I was intrigued, how can this organization be able to respond almost 24 hours later, 48 hours later? There must be something special about them. So when I saw that there was an opportunity open to work with IsraAid, I did not have to think twice. I really wanted to work with IsraAid.
So Polycarp became IsraAid's Kenya program manager. With his background in water engineering, he was well placed to oversee IsraAid's response to Turkana's chronic water shortage. IsraAid's drought response in Turkana unfolded in 2 phases. First came the emergency relief, where the only priority was keeping people alive. A team of locals, as well as on-the-ground Israelis, organized water trucking, sending tankers rumbling across the desert to deliver potable water to remote villages. This was stopgap aid, expensive and inefficient, but a literal lifesaver. For 2.5 months, IsraAid kept the water trucks running, preventing a bad situation from becoming a total catastrophe. At the same time, they repaired the old boreholes that no longer pumped out water. Nerd corner. What's a borehole? You have no idea. Neither do I. Well, let me tell you what it is. It's a very deep, very narrow hole in the ground. Long ago, someone built hand pumps that could bring the water up to the surface safely. But many of those hand pumps were broken, leaving precious water deep underground. Tauntingly close, but impossible to reach. So as the water tankers made their deliveries, IsraAid workers repaired and upgraded those pumps. The water delivery and upgraded pumps were short-term fixes, and that was not enough. No one can stop a drought from coming, but aid workers can help Turkana's community mitigate it next time. It was time for a long-term solution. The team drilled 3 new boreholes and repaired the old ones. They replaced the broken manual pumps with solar-powered electric pumps and trained locals on maintenance and repair. For years, the sun had punished Turkana. Now, it was helping to nourish its people. Solar pumps mean no diesel fuel, no expensive electricity bills, and a much higher volume of water accessible without manual labor.
So with a solar-powered system which is mechanized, now you don't need someone to be pulling up and down. Someone just goes and switches on, switch like a switch of a power on, and you get your water. The beauty again with upgrading from this hand-powered system, 1, you reduce the time that it takes for the system to break down, and 2, you are able to take the water to communities. You are able to take the water to exactly to their households and to their homesteads.
Once they had water flowing, IsraAid built the systems to store and distribute it. They erected giant steel tanks hooked up to a system of pipes that carried clean water to central points. Village centers, schools, health clinics, newly built animal troughs. No more 5-mile walks to a dry riverbed. Just a few steps to a tap.
We were able to reach over 25,000 people with water. The malnutrition rates, especially for children under 5, they were really high because of the drought. They went up to 26.5% malnutrition rates in this region during that drought period. So part of our response, we also put a nutrition program into part of our response so that we can able to support these under 5 children that were in acute malnutrition rates.
On the day the new water system was inaugurated, the whole community showed up. Parents, elders, kids, singing and dancing in relief. Clean, accessible water ripples out to every aspect of community life. Fewer waterborne illnesses, better hygiene and sanitation, improved nutrition, proper education.
The parents here are very happy. The songs that the community sang for Israel, they were praising Israel for that good job, for the water they received that enabled their children not to be going to the river again.
It's a really inspiring story, the kind that makes you realize just how much me, take for granted. And there's a kind of like beauty in it too. Many early Zionist pioneers died of starvation and malaria and exhaustion. That's what happened in the early 1900s. Yet they kept flocking to this hard-scrabble, inhospitable patch of the world, driven by a vision of what the land could someday be, what their home someday would become. If the pioneering generation were still around, I'm talking the folks who came in 1880 and 1910, the people who literally built Tel Aviv on sand they wouldn't recognize today's Israel, its skyscrapers, its parks, its water surplus. As of 2026, Israel is the only country in the Middle East with a water surplus. And Israeli aid workers are applying those hard-won lessons to communities around the world, not because they can get something from it, not on behalf of their government, which at least half the country can't stand, but because Israel is a semi-collectivist society, because the Jewish people need community to survive, to thrive, and because when you zoom out, community expands well beyond other Jews or other Israelis. Community in the global sense means other human beings, and that's not hasbara. I'm not trying to say that all Israelis or all Jews are amazing people who will run towards disaster. I'm not saying that because it's not true. I'm not saying they're superior or more moral. Many times Jewish people are not that. I'm saying that built into the fabric of the Jewish people, of the Jewish religion, of the Jewish history, Jewish peoplehood, and the Jewish state is the acknowledgement that tribe matters, that family matters, that no man is an island, to borrow from John Donne. And by the way, it was my father's nickname for me. Instead of saying Noam back in the day, he'd say, hey, no man is an island. That I doesn't exist without we. And if you can help someone else, then you probably should, no matter who they are. Chapter 4, Afghanistan.
We begin this morning in Afghanistan, where the Taliban has overrun the Afghan army, taking over the country's capital.
Afghans woke up to a new country, a very different kind of country this morning. Out on the streets, it's relatively quiet, but it's heavily armed Taliban fighters who are in charge, manning the checkpoints. Desperate scenes as thousands of people try to get out in fear for their lives.
It's August of 2021. After 20 years, the U.S. military is finally pulling out of Afghanistan. But it's widely considered to be a messy, poorly planned, hasty retreat. And as the last American planes lift off, desperate Afghans cling to the wheels. Mothers pass infants to soldiers across barbed wire, desperate to spare their children a life under Taliban rule. The U.S.-backed government has fallen. The Taliban are back, and their reign of terror threatens everyone, particularly women, journalists, and anyone associated with the fallen republic. Anyone who worked with the Americans or championed women's rights is now in mortal danger. Desperate, thousands of Afghans start sending messages to anyone who might be able to help them leave the country. A female judge who once jailed Taliban fighters and wife-beaters sends WhatsApps into the void. An Afghan policewoman known for training other women officers moves from safe house to safe house as Taliban gunmen scour neighborhoods for female cops. And one young Afghan woman, captain of the celebrated Afghan girls robotics team, frantically emails every contact she can think of outside of the country. One of those emails finds its way to a British-Israeli journalist named Dana Harmon, and it ends up saving more than 40 lives.
It was like a nightmare. One day, the Taliban just came to Herat, and like after 2 or 3 days, they went to Kabul and took the capital. Many of the emails I sent to the people that I know them, and many of the organizations, many of the embassies, I know them. Please help me. I'm stuck in Afghanistan. But no one of them replied, except Dana.
4 years earlier, Dana had written a feature for the New York Times about Afghanistan's first all-girl robotics team. Bright teenage girls who had become international symbols of Afghan women's progress. Now those same girls were texting her, please help us. We are scared. Is there anything you can do? There was nothing Donna could do from thousands of miles away, so she went looking for someone who might be able to help. Yotam Pulitzer was on vacation in Japan with his family when Donna's message arrived, and at first he wasn't sure if IsraAid would be able to help. I probably don't need to tell you that IsraAid would be extremely unwelcome in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. IsraAid had no networks in Afghanistan, no teams on the ground, no infrastructure. But when you're the CEO of a humanitarian relief organization, people turn to you in a crisis, and Donna wasn't the only one to raise the alarm. Shortly after she made contact with Yotam, 2 other calls came in. One was from a philanthropist trying to extract the Afghan women's cycling team from the country, and the other was from a contact with ties to the Taliban who promised they could ensure safe passage for anyone who wanted to leave. That sealed it. IsraAid might not have had anyone on the ground, but no aid worker could knowingly condemn 2 groups of women, the cycling team and the robotics team, to a strangled half-life under the Taliban. What began as a few frantic phone calls turned into a covert, high-stakes international rescue act. Yotam described it as,
it's an operation that would put Fauda to shame, honestly.
Fauda, in case you've been living under a rock, is a really hit Israeli TV show that follows an undercover counter-terrorism unit. Seriously, watch it. If you're into that stuff, just prepare to be really anxious the entire time. That's if you're anything like me. Not sure that was a plug, but throwing that out there. Anyway, an undercover unit can infiltrate hostile territory, but Israeli aid workers absolutely cannot. There was no question of Yotam or Donna actually going to Afghanistan themselves with their Israeli passports. But they could set up camp right on the border in next door Tajikistan. Nerd Corner, I Googled Tajikistan and it looks shockingly beautiful. Have you been there? Anyone been there? Anyway, email me. Let me know how it is. Together with Roni Abulafia, an Israeli filmmaker, they spent every waking hour leveraging every single contact they had. It was a race against time. The Americans were leaving and Taliban checkpoints were tightening. And their initial plan of getting people out through the Kabul airport went to pieces when an ISIS suicide bomber killed 170 Afghans and 13 U.S. service members as the American retreat from Afghanistan was drawing to a close. The airport shut down, of course. It was time to come up with Plan B, a land evacuation. IsraAid organized a bus that would take the robotics team, the cycling team, and their family members to neighboring Tajikistan. The contact associated with the Taliban wrote up a safe passage permit that would allow the bus through checkpoints. Every passenger was warned, stay quiet, do not draw attention, and cover as much of your body as you can. Rodaba Nouri was on that bus. She remembers the first checkpoint well.
We just reached the first checkpoint of the Taliban. They didn't have GoPro. I just had abaya with my mask and also my scarf. And I was afraid if they ask me why you do not have GoPro. And don't all the time just tell me whenever you are in trouble, just put down your head. So I just put down my head.
Somehow the bus made it through every checkpoint without incident. And the bus reached the crossing into Tajikistan at nightfall. But the crossing was closed. No exceptions. Taliban fighters hovered around the stalled bus, eyeing its veiled passengers with suspicion. If they didn't get across the border soon, the entire operation would fail, and the 41 passengers would be hauled back into Kabul, and then whatever would come next. Only one person had the metaphorical keys to the crossing, the president of Tajikistan. Cool. Like, totally cool. Super easy to get a head of state on the phone, right?
And we realized we have to find a way to convince the president of Tajikistan. We also knew that the only way to get them visa would be to convince the president. You can't go to anyone, below him. So we started calling everyone. We started calling donors that we knew had some connections with high-level politicians. We called people who we heard they were investors in the country. And we reached to a very high level.
For 3 agonizing days and 2 nights, Yotam and his team tried to reach the president, all while the bus sat stalled at the border, surrounded by Taliban guards and their increasingly threatening questions. At any moment, the guards could have decided to tear up the permit of safe passage and order the bus back to Kabul, or worse. On day 3 of this ordeal, the president of Tajikistan finally picked up the phone. He agreed to open the border crossing if another country would take in these 41 refugees within 3 days of their crossing. The IsraAid team agreed, desperate. Now they just had to find another country that would take in 41 Afghan refugees in the next 3 days. Once again, Yotam took the phone, trying to reach a head of state.
And then another good friend of mine told me he has some high-level contacts in the UAE. And he was able to call a very famous TV personality there that he knew. And this guy is in very close contact with Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince. And he called him to tell him that there's a group who need shelter, and also that they were evacuated by an Israeli organization. These two reasons were enough for the crown prince to agree after 10 minutes. And finally, the Tajiki president agreed.
Back in the 90s, the UAE had actually recognized Taliban rule. But it was the new millennium, baby. Everything was different now. Just a year prior, the UAE had signed the Abraham Accords, normalizing its relations with Israel. Now they seized on the chance to join Israel in an unprecedented joint humanitarian mission. So Tajikistan opened its border, and the bus rolled through safely. Now its passengers just had to get to their new home in the UAE. Commercial flights were out of the question, given the sensitive nature of this escape mission. Once again, IsraAid workers manned the phones, calling every donor they could to raise funds for a private plane. The donors came through, and when the plane finally landed in Abu Dhabi in the early hours of September 6, 2021, its exhausted passengers stepped off to an astonishing scene.
And then we got a charter flight. We got them all on the charter flight. 42 of these Afghans who flew over to Abu Dhabi.
And the plane landed in Abu Dhabi. And I remember they were waiting almost with the red carpet. They wanted to show that the partnership between Israel and the Emirates is about shared values.
But the story doesn't end there.
It was 41 girls. And then in a typical Israeli fashion, we said, we pulled out 41 girls. Let's do another group.
Israelis leading the world in sheer chutzpah. High on their success, their team geared up for a second evacuation. This time they went big, ferrying 125 female police officers, judges, activists, and other high-risk targets to safety. Among this group was an 83-year-old woman, the last remaining Jew in Afghanistan. But as the team put the finishing touches on the evacuation plan, the Taliban caught wind of the scheme.
The second group was much bigger, and they were actually blocked by the Taliban and arrested for almost a day, and threatened by the Taliban that if they'll try to leave the country again, they will all be killed or put in prison.
After tense negotiations, which probably involved hefty bribes, the Taliban released the group on the condition they wouldn't attempt another escape. The team agreed. They were lying. But this time they wouldn't escape by land, but by air. Yet again, IsraAid chartered a private plane, this one taking off from Mazar-e-Sharif, a northern city with a functioning airport. Yotam can't tell me how exactly he obtained the Taliban's permission for takeoff, alluding merely to, quote, some very influential people. Whatever the team did, whoever they bribed, it worked. The plane took off. First stop, Albania, a small Muslim majority country with a lot of experience taking in desperate refugees. Nerd corner alert, and this is an important one. Albania is the only European country whose Jewish population increased during World War II. The country never deported its Jews and even opened its doors to any Jew fleeing the Nazis, an honor code they called Besa, which means keeping the promise. It's a sacred vow to maintain honor, compassion, and hospitality, which means treating guests as though your home is theirs. I promise I'm not working for the Albanian Tourism Board. I promise, I really do. But in an episode about humanitarian aid, it seems right to emphasize Albania. Okay, end of Nerd Corner, back to our wild story. Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama had publicly offered to shelter Afghan refugees. When he got the call from IsraAid, he was all in. Helping refugees, he said, was Albania's historical duty. Once again, Afghan refugees evacuated by IsraAid landed in a foreign country to a warm welcome, including the 83-year-old Jewish woman, her 2 kids, and her 4 grandchildren. Tova Muradi was born into a thriving Jewish community in Kabul. Now in her 80s, she was fleeing the same streets she'd walked her whole life, carried to safety by her brothers and sisters in Israel. It's an amazing story. It's outrageous. But it still isn't over. Remember, IsraAid's motto, remember what it is? It's first one's in, last one's out. While they had rescued nearly 200 people, things weren't over. Now they began the long and arduous process of supporting them, providing housing, schooling, food, healthcare, trauma counseling, and eventually resettlement. Most of the evacuees ended up in Canada, where the robotics team members are now university students. The cyclists bike wherever they want. The judges still advocate for human rights, and Tova Muradi can be openly Jewish again.
A lot of these Afghan girls are now sending me Shabbat Shalom every week. And 2 years ago, when I received the Bronfman Award, which was a very big honor and privilege, the keynote speaker was actually the captain of the Afghan girls robotics team. So they all sort of became ambassadors for building bridges and for connecting between Israel and the Muslim world and Jews and Muslims. And so there was a ripple effect beyond this rescue operation, which was quite intense.
The captain of the robotics team puts it simply.
Only thing which is important is humanity and to be kind to each other, to love each other, and to really understand each other. All the time in Afghanistan, they say that Afghans are like sisters and brothers to each other, but no one of those sisters and brothers really helped me, except my friend who is from Israel. She helped me.
I haven't stopped thinking about the story, about IsraAid, for months, because after talking to Yotam and his colleagues and my team speaking with them, I genuinely believe, all of us do, all of us believe them, all, when they say that their only goal is helping people. Everything else, building bridges, gaining political capital, whatever, is basically, it's irrelevant. It's nice, it's good, but it's irrelevant. In fact, IsraAid's most unusual mission stayed secret for a long time. In 2024, they traveled to another disaster zone, like they always do. But this disaster was different. It was a war zone, and the army wreaking so much devastation was their army. The army in which they and their friends and their families had once served. The army to which their children would someday enlist. The army that had only entered Gaza after Hamas terrorists bulldozed Israel's security fence, taking over 22 border communities in a horrific orgy of torture, rape, slaughter, and kidnapping. How on earth does an Israeli NGO operate in war-torn Gaza? And how does Israeli society react to these efforts? To seeing aid workers come in and no hostages come out? If Israel is a semi-collective society, if Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh, if all Jews are responsible for one another, if the country only works when the people are at least marginally united, what happens to Israeli society when aid workers try to help some of the same people who celebrated and cheered on October 7th? Was this a betrayal of Israel or an expression of its highest values? We'll have to wait and see. Tune in next week for our second and final installment on IsraAid. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, an OpenDor Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, if you appreciated it, if you learned from it, share it with a friend who you think will appreciate it and may want to learn from it themselves. And leave us a rating on Apple or Spotify. It really does help other people find the show. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Simon Apfel, Adi Elbaz, Ari Schlacht, and Rob Pera. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for being here. See you next week.